Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Meta Recap for the Lightbringer and A-Dank-Elmo patch. Just wanted to get this out of the way before the 4th anniversary update because there's quite a lot of things coming. So to begin with, we will start with the new units, Lightbringer. So, these are just things that I noticed with their role relative to the current environment of Apex. Lightbringer, the thing about her is that you can pick her early without feeling bad because she has access to faction buff plus strengthen. And that means she is not just a tank but a buffer at the same time. So just to give an example, let's say you start off with Lost Hand. And then when it's time to pick your second unit, you look at your opponent's box and you see things like Elwin, Helena, and Rosalia. Rosalia's not really that common of a unit right now, but just an example. And then you see those units and you want to pick a tank. Previously, it would be Hilda. You pick the Hilda, and then now you have Lost Hand plus Hilda. So you're thinking you want a faction buff. But by the time it is your third pick, you have already gotten your Epsilon and Luxia back. So your strengthen options might be something like, CC White Mass Attack, which kind of feels awful because one, you are bringing Mass Attack on CC White, which means that you cannot bring Inspire. Two, you are picking CC White. That means you have Lost Ham, Tank, and Healer. And by the time your 4th and 5th pick comes, you're basically gonna lose all of your good DPS. With Lightbringer, because she has Strengthen, you can avoid all of that, and your 3rd pick can just be like another good DPS because Strengthen has a low cooldown, and she can buff both if they are not buffable by her faction buff. Secondly, she has consistent mixed bulk, which means she's good against both physical and magic damage, thanks to her talent and good troop options. Her talent basically means that you cannot dispel her defense, magic defense, and you can survive better that way. And she has Guardian Infantry, Phalanx, and Templar Knights for her troop options, which means that you basically have all three of the triangle, Cavalry, Infantry, and Lancer. So as long as you don't get sandwiched into, let's say you're fighting Gintoki and Elwin, and then you kind of struggle that way because bring Phalanx, you die to Gintoki, you bring Guardian Infantry, you die to Elwin, and then Templar Knights is kind of your only options, but Templar Knights are better at tanking magic damage, so you still kind of feel bad about bringing that into 2 physical units. So as long as you don't give an overwhelming amount of tank busting, you should be able to stay alive quite long, even with limited sustain. And finally, she actually contributes to damage and sustain. So what this means is that you can use Lightbringer to either heal by hitting someone with a Discipline plus Gate of Eternal Life, or you can just use her to finish off a weakened unit. So a lot of the other tanks, let's say, Hilda has been played as a mono tank for a lot of aggressive players for a long time before this, and your Hilda actually cannot finish off weakened units. Let's say like that assassin comes in, kills your mage, they take like 60% from counter, and Hilda cannot finish that, so you actually have to spend and move on your other DPS to kill that off. Lightbringer, most of the time, if they are weakened, she can actually finish them off, and at the same time heal another unit if you're getting chipped by an AoE or something like that. So it's pretty nice, and if you're fighting a more like tank pushy kind of lineup, like you're all just chilling together, she can help to do damage and heal herself at the same time, compared to other tanks that are relevant right now. Next up, we have A-Dank-Elmo. She's a very strong tempo unit, but she suffers slightly from a slow start. But she gets increasingly stronger as the game drags on. So she excels in Mexican standoff kind of games, where both players are just kind of standing near the fort, their respective side of the map, and they're just kind of waiting for the breeze to proc first. And she excels in those kind of matchups because the longer the game goes, the map gets smaller, and then they will have to get closer to your portal. So you can take advantage of them being closer to you. But she suffers on turn 1 because she pretty much cannot do anything on that turn because she needs to place her portal down before she can get her +2 unit range. But, if the game lasts to turn 3, turn 4, they get kind of close to your portal, and then, she becomes very oppressive because you can just go through the portal, pick them off, and then possibly even go back depending on whether you have like IBC support or not. Dropnir plus Warlock will mutual kill a lot of assassins, but her single target damage might suffer at lower stars if you bring Crystal Warlocks. So high star I think is not a problem anymore because her 30% damage increase on top of having 20% damage on her 2C skill. And I say a lot of sins, but some sins can possibly survive that. For example, Double Bladed Warner, if your damage is sufficient to kill her in one hit, he might survive. Epsilon with Nebulous Robe generally will survive as well, but Epsilon hitting a Yani at range has other problems as well, like you are kind of gambling into a Tenyo at the same time, because I think Yani most of the time carries Tenyo Headdress, because I don't think she needs to worry too much about anti-reflect at the moment. She's slightly underwhelming into tank plus immunities, which is basically tank plus Rosen, but she still supports with her portals and does contribute to the damage counter quite significantly. So I say slightly underwhelming, but it kind of just depends what you're going up against. And it's relative to like who is getting more progression in the game. So let's say if you have like Yani plus Lucretia and you're fighting a tank push comp without assassins. Let's say their DPS is something like Gintoki plus 2 healers. And you actually get progress when you hit their tank because both Yani and Lucretia can quote-unquote hit for free. Like Yani can hit and then jump back, same with Lucretia with her puppet. And you're not really getting threatened in any way because your opponent has to go through your tank at the same time. So in that case, it's still kind of nice because you're still chipping away at their tank, and even if they have healers, eventually you will be able to break their tank, hopefully. But if they are having a tank, but they have assassins, then it's kind of bad because you hit their tank, you jump back, eventually the assassins are going to get through you and you won't be able to get their tank killed before your mages die. Then, you have a draft problem and you have to go back to the drawing board. So moving on, taking a look at these two boxes. The box on the left is basically what I ended up with at the end of last meta recap, which is basically the last update. And the box on the right is what I am currently playing before the next Zerida 2 update. So first off, the main difference is you will notice that the two tanks are completely different. I've went from Grenier Hilda to Landius Lightbringer. Other than that, I've taken out Elwyn, Lovina, and Oboro in favor for McLean, Yani, and Archon. So starting off with the tanks, initially I subbed out Grenier for Lightbringer, which is kind of a no-brainer. Even though Lightbringer was low star, I wanted to try her out, see how tanky she is and her damage as well. But over time, I changed it to Lightbringer plus Landius for a couple of reasons. First off, let's see what Hilda does, or what Hilda used to do. She used to be the premier physical tank in her Lancer form, and her counterpart would be Christian as the premier magical tank, which she still kind of is. In her cavalry class, she is basically an act again blocker with balance blade. She puts her 3x5 tiles, and basically it counters opponent act again units like Die Hard, Wet Ham, Cherry, Lost Ham, those kind of units. She's also a hard counter to displacement due to her 3-block aura that prevents any sort of displacement. And she is also immune to mobility reduction, which means that you cannot disable her guard that way. So with these same points, let's see the problems with Hilda in the current environment. Lancer Hilda will just straight up get eaten by Gintoki. Even if you turn yourself to carry form, there's a chance to get dispelled, the conversion. And at the same time, she is also vulnerable to everything like heal reversal, buff dispelling, and passive block. So from Wet Ham and Elwyn, even though her matchup is generally positive against those units, but if they can prevent you from guarding, their allies will be able to take advantage of that, and then you lose the value of actually having a tank, and you will probably lose that way. Secondly, for her cavalry form, many act again units are actually assassins. The examples I gave, Die Hard, Cherry, and Lost Ham. But, well, first off, they can still act again right outside of the tiles. So in the case of Die Hard, Die Hard is the main one, I guess, because versus Lost Ham, you will just put the tile directly on top of the terrain. So for Die Hard, as an example, you kind of have to put your units like quite far away from your Hilda. Like you have to push your Hilda very far up to place the tiles, and then you put your units like 2 to 3 blocks behind her outside of guard, because otherwise the diehard will just strike, kill your unit that is within guard but still in range of him, and then he can't run back, but it's job done, he got his kill. So you have to place it a little bit further behind your Hilda, and if you do that, that opens up to things like wet ham as well, so it's not that straightforward. And because of this contradictory matchup, it's kind of difficult to draft Hilda in the current environment, because you pick the tank, so you are generally scared of assassins, you ban them. But if you're banning all these act against assassins, what's the point of picking a balanced plate Hilda? So because of this, it's a little bit awkward in the draft. And regarding her immunities, it's not really worth a slot just to counter Archon and Himiko. I guess Archon players will generally first ban Hilda, and I think Hilda eating a first ban is very valued. But if they don't ban it, or you run into a matchup that just doesn't care about Hilda, it feels kind of bad, because most relevant reincarnation units can self-buff, so even Hilda's faction buff doesn't bring much value to the game right now. Relevant reincarnation units is pretty much just Lucretia and Tejas at the moment. Both of them have strengthen and mass attack respectively. And whereas what Landius brings to the table is he buffs a fuck ton of meta units, and specifically DPSs. If you just take a look at my box that I showed earlier, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ELS DPS units. And out of the remaining DPS, Wet Ham can buff himself, Diehard buffs himself, a female unit, and even Origins if he wants. Lucretia has mass attack, Tejas has strengthened. So that leaves Lost Ham, but Lost Ham has a lot of other ways to get his buff as well. Diehard and Epsilon can faction buff him, and he can get strengthened from anywhere between, pretty much all the holy units in my box can offer some sort of strengthen or mass attack. Lightbringer strengthen, Lucretia mass attack, Tejas strengthen, IBC has mass attack, Lucretia has mass attack if she really wants to, or you can just rely on her act again to give 30% attack. So yeah, these two tanks actually happen to round out the attack buffs very well relative to Hilda in the past. Other than that, he is also gonna get his casting skill in the next update, which allows him to be immune to passive block, which improves his matchup against Elwyn and Wet Ham primarily, because Elwyn can't just one-shot you through the passive anymore, and Wet Ham, if you get Despair, you basically don't have a revive, and he can just one-shot you that way. But after his casting skill gets released, that won't be a problem anymore, and he pretty much will tank 2 hits at the minimum unless you're going up against direct anti-revive units like Zerida 2, Rio, which doesn't really exist, or Clotes AoE debuff. So those are the main ways where you can die in 1 hit, I guess. And finally, we have the emergence of this build. So Landius Enchant has kind of gone everywhere in the past. Like in season 1, most people played Dawns or Full Moon, and then eventually people that still wanted to play Landius later on changed to Steel, and now we are seeing the emergence of this build. So it is Mirror Armor, Dawns, Holy Arm. So traditionally, Landius has been pretty weak against physical melee units, specifically because his talent does not offer any damage reduction against melee units. And most melee units are physical, with the exception of things like IPC. And what this build does is basically, I'm playing him in a mostly offensive environment. There's very limited sustain. I'm only playing 1 healer, and beyond that is just Goel healing. Which means that if he takes a hit, he's generally going to stay at that HP for the rest of the game. So this is the easiest way to bring value out of his HP. Because, let's say, this build basically tries to catch things like Gintoki, Elwyn, Wet Ham. I've said Elwyn, Wet Ham like 3 or 4 times just talking about Landius, but those are the units that he's traditionally weak against. And this build tries to capitalize on that by straight up counter killing them when they hit your Landius. And usually you can just straight up win the game from that advantage because you still have a second life, and they lose a unit when taunts procs. Even if you don't get a taunts proc and the immediate counter kill, they will generally take so much damage that you might be able to finish them off with a normal attack, and you don't need to expand another skill just to counter kill them. Well, for this build, I'm missing the lightning spear, which is pretty nice because it's extra defense and also an extra source of fixed damage when they hit you. The thunder spear works both offensively and defensively. It procs on both sides, but I don't have that, so I'm just sticking with his exclusive right now, which is still kind of nice against some mages right now, I guess. Yani, Lucretia, Tejas. It does offer him a little bit more survivability against those. And moving on, just to cover a little bit more about the new additions. McLean finally hit 6 stars, so his 2 tiles terrain is very nice for zone control. And his access to Glacier Elementals, is that his name? I think that's the name of the troop. It gives him very good kill range because they do magic damage, despite McLean using Spirit Boots, which is a HP defense accessory. And his talent and aquatic defense bonus gives him very solid stats, especially if you have a faction buff on top of that from Landius. This is mostly referring to attack and defense. His magic defense is still very low, and if you get hit by magic, he'll just melt like bah. And the talent, attack plus the magic troop basically covers both his hero and troop damage. And with that combination, you can even kill things like Shrine Maiden healers fairly consistently, I would say. At least for Rosen. I don't know about other healers that have better troop stats and base HP, but I've killed a few Rosens with McLean just out of nowhere as long as you have an attack buff, because McLean does physical damage to the troops, and you have enough attack to kill off all their Shrine Maidens, and then your magic troops will do unresisted damage to their hero. So it's pretty nice, and you can even kill things like generally tankier DPS like Wet Hand. You can kill them as well. And because his act again applies the tile to within 2 blocks of himself, you can actually deny enemy turret, which also is a factor for his damage, because he's the only assassin that can just erase enemy defensive turret. And finally, we have Archon. So I think Archon, I've mentioned him a couple of times in the past already. He just does what he does. He's a very straightforward DPS. He benefits a lot from the decline of Hilda. There are a lot of people adapting to this new tank combination of Lightbringer and Landius. So Archon is very happy about that, because he doesn't need to spend the first ban on Hilda anymore. He's effectively a half assassin, because most like other assassins, they ignore guard and kill a unit, whereas for Archon, he tries to hook a unit outside of guard and kill them there. So he's half assassin because it's not always possible to do. Like, enemy will try to position their DPS behind their tank so that you can't pull them outside of guard. But they can't maintain that formation forever, because as the map gets closer, they you can kind of even go below them or like to the sides and hook them out from that direction. And eventually they will have to do something, right? Like, they're not just gonna sit there forever unless they are a stall comp, in which case Archon might suffer a little bit, like if you're going up against Oboro, which doesn't care about any displacement. So other than that, if you're fighting like a relatively normal tank push lineup, the enemy will have to approach you to try and do something, otherwise you can just chill and wait. Oops. Archon will get his exclusive in the next update, which allows him to keep his buffs when he does his act again things, which means that he can actually have an attack buff now. So not sure how relevant this is for his kill range, because Archon already kills a lot of things without an attack buff, so more damage is better, I guess. And it also gives him healing, so you don't lose out from dropping Flower Boon Bonnet. And finally, this is a point that I've said multiple times, having a revive makes him very good for trading matchups. So there aren't that many matchups where you find Archon being dead weight. Like, if he's dead weight, just don't pick him, right? Just pick your other DPS. Like, there's almost every DPS is good right now. So yeah, that's that. Finally, in terms of the overall meta, I can't really say too much because from my experience, at least in gold rank when I'm playing other accounts, it's still kind of anything goes. There's anywhere between 0 to 4 tanks, 0 to 4 healers, and the DPS generally are very similar. Like maybe there are like 2 or 3 units that are rotating in and out. Most notably, TJS and Werner is kind of falling off a little bit, but otherwise, the tank plus healer number is kind of anywhere, and then the DPS is mostly similar. So with reference to what I'm running right now, if you are going, if you're following the meta, meta DPS units, and following next month will be Zerida 2 as well, right? So looking at McLean, Yani, and Zerida 2, these units aren't really the best at zoning. Like, they kind of want to just chill at the back and set up a little bit before they finally get ready. Like let's not talk about Zerida 2 first. That's for next update. So right now, looking at my box, McLean has a 1-turn setup time because he needs to use his 3C before he can get his Ignore Guard skill, which is his primary form of offense. Gintoki chills at the back. He's a pure janitor. He almost never goes in first. Lucretia basically has 3+5 range at turn 1. 8 range is pretty much not zoning anything, especially if you take into account any kind of terrain. TJS is also not really a zoner as well because her method of initiation involves teleporting on top of another unit that has already gone in. And nowadays, TJS is more of a supportive character anyways. Lost Ham can initiate on turn 1, or at least zone on turn 1, but it's map dependent. Pepsi cannot do shit on turn 1, he has to faction buff, Yani has to place portals, Werner has to get into stance, Archon has okay threat range, but it's just slightly higher than Lucretia at 9, because he moves 4, Tidal Surge for 2, and then his hook is 3 range. So, just looking overall at my box, basically the only units that can offer any zoning potential on turn 1 would be Wetham, Die Hard. That's kind of it. If you have an IBC or if you get a good map, Lost Ham could be there as well. IBC with Archon and Lucretia is also not too bad, as it's just +2 to the threat range. 10 and 11, that is a lot more respectable than 8 and 9. Because 8 and 9, you're basically not going to zone anything. And what that means is that this kind of box, specifically mine, because I don't have that much sustain, I'm just playing 1 healer, I'm quite susceptible to getting rushed on player 2 at the start of turn 2, because they can position their unit very aggressively. Their last unit, they can just put it somewhere near the middle of the map, and if I cannot threaten it, then I am just going to get initiated on at the start of turn 2. So that is one of the main glaring weaknesses for this box. And there's 2 ways to look at it, right? One, I play a bit more defensively. I put things like Rosen into my box, sub out maybe Werner or TJS, which is going to fall out of meta soon. Or I just have to correct my draft in a way where I prioritize banning long range units versus units that are strong. Like the easiest example is actually just Gintoki, because Gintoki is a strong ass unit, is a hyper carry, and like if you draft incorrectly, he can just 1v5 your team. But the problem with Gintoki is that he's a go in later unit, he's a janitor. So if you give Gintoki and the enemy picks up Gintoki, that is an extra 2 bans that I can spend on banning units that directly threaten me immediately before I finish setting up. So, you can kind of adapt your draft in that way. You kind of give these slower units and try to play a Mexican standoff game. And yeah, so when you play these kind of meta units, you need to know what you're getting into. So yeah, that's about it for this episode. Hope you guys enjoyed. See you guys in the next one. Peace.